Welcome to Conversations with B'nai B'rith International. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thank you for joining us today. Well, during each congressional session, the first order of business in both the U.S. House and Senate isn't a speech, an announcement of the day's schedule, or even the Pledge of Allegiance. It's a prayer offered by a chaplain or a guest chaplain. And among the guest chaplains, there have been many rabbis. With me today to explore the 160 years of Jewish prayers in American government is Howard Mortman, author of the new book, When Rabbis Bless Congress, the great American story of Jewish prayers on Capitol Hill. Mortman and I delve into his analysis of the more than 400 rabbis who have delivered prayers in the literal and figurative center of American democracy since the Civil War. Mortman is communications director for C-SPAN, a public service network providing television coverage of Congress. A veteran of Washington, D.C. media organizations, he's observed Congress from positions at MSNBC, National Journal's Hotline, the Broadcasting Board of Governors, and New Media Strategies. Howard, great to have you with us today.
Thank you, Dan. I appreciate this very much. This is going to be a fun conversation, but thank you for having me join in with you.
Well, we're looking forward to it. When Rabbis Bless Congress explores the tradition of Jewish prayer in Congress, something that no other work has examined. Where did you first get the idea for writing the book? You could have written about so many topics relating to the Congress. I mean, you've been an observer of it for decades. Did this idea stem from your experience on Capitol Hill, or did it come from somewhere else?
Actually, it's funny. It comes immediately from my experience covering Congress with C-SPAN. As you mentioned, I'm the communications director of C-SPAN, so I watch a lot of Congress. You know, we show gavel-to-gavel coverage of the House and the Senate. And when you watch Congress every single day, I noticed something really interesting. And as you mentioned in the introduction, just as a curiosity, the first thing that they do every day in the House and in the Senate is pray. And that moment, and again, I'm not, whether or not they should, I don't care. Just for me, it was curious, why do they do this? And it looks like nothing else during the day. There's no debate, there's no voting, there's no acrimony, there's no anger. It's just a straightforward prayer to God. And so just as an observer of Congress, it kind of stuck, well, let me watch. That became my appointment television, to watch every prayer, just to see what they were talking about. Now, every so often, for whatever reason, when the official chaplain, and again, as you mentioned, both the House and the Senate have official chaplains paid for by the taxpayers with offices and staff. Every so often, for whatever reason, they are not there to deliver the opening prayer. They have guest chaplains fill in. And it could be from any religion from across the country. They come in and they give the opening prayer. Now, that happens on rare occasions. Even rarer occasions than that are rabbis who fill in as guest chaplains when the official chaplain doesn't do it. Now, it's not very often. It happens roughly in pre-pandemic times, roughly about 7 or 8 times a year, a rabbi is guest chaplain. So it's not a frequent occurrence, but enough for me that watching Congress, being Jewish, when a rabbi gave a prayer in Congress, I would perk up and pay even more attention. So that got me, that's where the initial spark came from, just out of curiosity. Who are these rabbis and what do they say when they prayed in Congress?
So when does Congress begin inviting chaplains? Was this one of the first acts of Congress? It goes back to the very, very beginning of Congress. When believe it or not, actually the first thing they did was to appoint a chaplain to give a prayer. And even before Congress, the Continental Congress, the first thing they did was appoint a chaplain to give a prayer. So the tradition, let's take Jews and rabbis out of the equation for a moment. Just the very practice of praying in Congress goes back to the very beginning, and it happens every day that they're in session. So it is a tradition, as you mentioned, before even the Pledge of Allegiance. So it's very much part and parcel of what Congress does every day. And over the years, the practice itself has been challenged in the Supreme Court. There have been cases questioning should any legislative body, let alone Congress, even local city council, start with a prayer. And every time the practice of prayer beginning any kind of government entity has been challenged,
the courts ultimately rule on the side of allowing that prayer to happen. So, yeah, it's not a Jewish tradition, but it's very much a beginning of, it's an origin story kind of tradition.
Well, the founding fathers were very clear, at least most of them, on the issue of separation of church and state. So it's curious as to how important this idea of opening a session of Congress with a prayer would have been at a time when there was a discussion amongst them about separation. Does any of that come through in your research?
Yeah, I love that question because one thing I don't do in the book, and this is intentional, definitely, yeah, I mean, I could say that this is protected, this is their tradition, but you still say, well, how can they do this? How can there be a prayer in Congress? And it's a totally legitimate question. The church-state argument looms over this whole project, over the whole book. I don't care about that. What I care about is the history of the rabbi, of the over 400 rabbis who have delivered over 600 prayers in Congress. Because if I were to say, and I'm not advocating this, if I were to say, you know what, I don't even like Congress giving prayers. Why should they even give? I'm going to ignore this. You're ignoring a huge part, huge being the hundreds of rabbis, part of American Jewish history, who have done this, who have amazing stories lying underneath. So just to ignore that because you may not like the practice, I think does a disservice. The church-state argument, it's funny, when Congress allows multiple religions to pray in Congress, to me, and this is a personal opinion, that shows the breadth of religions. I actually think that's a strength for America, to show how many religions we accept and acknowledge. And even if you want to go even deeper, the Establishment Clause, going back to what you're saying at the very beginning, the fact that over 400 rabbis have prayed in Congress, ultimately, that's the ultimate evidence that there is no established religion in America, because you wouldn't have had 400, 600 times a rabbi has prayed. So if this book is not a church-state book, but it is in many ways just a history of a Jewish and Congressional history that, as you said, just can't be ignored, just laying there, just waiting to be researched.
Well, talk to us about the criteria that clergy have to meet in order to be considered for selection to deliver a prayer before Congress. And also, I found very interesting the guidelines for what a chaplain more or less can say or cannot say or cannot include in their prayers. Tell us about that.
Yeah, let's do the guidelines first. This is really interesting, and it has developed over time. And I've found through my research. So the guidelines are basically keep it short, 200, 250 words. Keep it in English. Don't refer to a foreign country. There's a couple of things that are really interesting from our perspective, being Jewish. That some wording in there, but the most important point, the guideline is, when a clergy member, again, not just Jewish, but any guest chaplain shows up, don't get involved in politics. Don't get involved in policy. Your role is essentially to pray to God and not even address the members in the chambers. It's a loftier kind of connecting the chamber with the Almighty. And so the practice, the guest chaplains themselves roughly came on the scene roughly in the 1850s. Was the first time a fill-in chaplain was officially there in that role. The first rabbi of 1860, but only 10 years after the first guest chaplain. But you asked how are they selected for the guest chaplains? A lot of it, this may not surprise you or the viewers. It's local politics and not political, not partisan, but typically members of the community, constituents, members of the clergy who are close to a member of Congress. For the most part, the members of Congress sponsor those clergy members. Definitely with the rabbis that I research, many of them in their sponsoring remarks, the members of Congress, meaning the House of Representatives or the senators, connect somehow to the rabbi from their local community.
Well, let's go back to the guidelines. The one point in those guidelines, which really I found very interesting considering Jewish prayer, is that the prayer has to be delivered in English, but so many direct references. I mean, we see this when we're in synagogue Shabbat or any day that we go to synagogue. For us, this is for most American Jews, English and Hebrew. How is that dealt with in these prayers?
So I love that question because I have found in my research a couple really cool things. One, when the guidelines now say you can't speak a foreign language, I think those are somewhat new or newer, because I found, and this is extraordinary to see, I found in old congressional records, like from the 1960s, 1950s, early 1970s, Hebrew appears in the congressional record. And it's really stunning when you go back and suddenly out of nowhere, you see actual Hebrew letters as the opening when they're praying, like, they're praying to God, but they're doing it in Hebrew, and you see the prayers, or they conclude with saying the Shekhinah or other prayers at the end, and the Hebrew is in the congressional record. So I think it's more of a current phenomenon. I have found through the video, rabbis who have prayed. I'll tell you a great example, and I love this example. In 1994, Rabbi Maurice Lyons of St. Louis was guest chaplain in the Senate, and he gave a really interesting prayer. But he ended by quoting the Shekhinah and saying from the Book of Numbers. He did it in Hebrew, and he raised his hands over the Senate like it's almost a congregation. He gave the prayer. Now, it's there in video. It's there in Hebrew. I always really liked his prayer. He has since he's passed away. About a year ago, maybe half a year ago, his family was Googling him on his yahrzeit, the anniversary of his death, and they came across the YouTube that I had posted of that prayer. I've posted every rabbi for whom there's video on YouTube with the prayer, and they came across it, and they had never seen that prayer before. I think some of the grandkids never even heard him in person. But that's an example of just a really interesting prayer using Hebrew. That thanks to video, we can see all that now.
Let's talk again about it's kind of stay away from politics, just give the lofty prayer. What kinds of prayers were given, let's say, during the Great Depression? Yeah. Where it would seem to me that you'd have to recognize what was going on in society, or certainly during the Holocaust. So do we see those issues coming into the prayers?
So that's wonderful to talk about. And it's so much, if you're a lover of history, you can see the American story being told in many ways through these prayers, and even with the rabbi prayers. And you can see the prayers reflecting what's happening outside the chambers or even inside the chambers, whether it's big cultural, the Depression, the Holocaust, big moments in American history that we're experiencing, World War II, or big debates that are happening inside the chamber. An example, the Holocaust is a really interesting example because you see the rhetoric, the language, the prayers somewhat adopting during the war to what's happening, but not entirely. It's really after World War II when we really see the horrors of the Holocaust that you start seeing mentions of them. But even more than just the mentions of the Holocaust in the prayer are, and I love this part, are survivors, Holocaust survivors who survived many times the camps, came to America, became rabbis, and ended up praying in the literal center of democracy. I think it was something like 6 Auschwitz survivors ended up being rabbis who prayed in Congress, which is amazing. Talk about a victory over Hitler, just to be able to survive that and then pray in Congress. And there have been survivors even up until last year who have prayed in Congress. Another big cultural touchstone, the Vietnam War. You can tell in the prayers of rabbis who shifted in their attitudes broadly, talking about the Vietnam War. In the earlier days, more bravado, more saying we're going to, American, our boys overseas, we're going to win. And then you start seeing prayers saying, I don't want to put words in their mouth, but kind of doubting, why we're there, and saying, when we come home, we have so many things we need to address. And you kind of see that language coming in the prayers as well. There actually were a lot of rabbi prayers in the 60s during the Vietnam War. So, yeah, there are other big moments in American history, the space program, gets a lot of mentions by rabbis. The Gemini rockets, the space shuttle, and all the other great moments are all mentioned because they may have given prayers when the ships went up, when the rocket ships went up, and so on. So it's really reflective of their times.
So who was the first Jewish clergyman selected as a chaplain, and when and how was he chosen? And what was that prayer? What was that first prayer about?
Rabbi, let's introduce your viewers, Dan, to Rabbi Morris Raphael. Rabbi Morris Raphael, born in Sweden, as an immigrant, was the first rabbi in 1860, February of 1860, to pray in the U.S. Congress from B'nai Jeshurun congregation in New York City, an immigrant. And he prayed in Congress, the first prayer, and James Buchanan was president. This was the eve of the Civil War. And you see in his very lengthy prayer, we talked earlier about how there are more restrictions, including length. Back then, it's like a page and a half in the Congressional record. It's a very long prayer. But it includes language about brothers, about brother against brother. And you see almost like a foreshadowing of the Civil War. This is roughly about a year before the Civil War began. And again, Lincoln wasn't president yet. I'm not a Morris Raphael scholar. There are Morris Raphael scholars. He actually, and this is going to a different direction, but he was pro-slavery. So he was the first rabbi prayed, had written about slavery in a very positive way. So it's kind of a really interesting detour in American history. Known by others as a celebrity rabbi, he was very outspoken and made a lot of appearances with politicians and so on. And his first appearance by a Jew in the center of the House was a shock to the system, both to the reporters who were in the chamber covering it, as well as to other members of Congress. I mean, and he shows up and I think the New York Times described it at the time in 1860 as his full canonicals. So you can imagine what it's like to have a rabbi wearing the tallis, presumably, and a yarmulke, show up and give a prayer. But he was the first one. So Rabbi Morris Raphael, 1860, was the first rabbi to ever pray in Congress.
So the Jewish population in the United States in 1860 would be under 1 million people, well under 1 million people, because we didn't have yet. We had the immigration of the late 1840s from Central Europe. We didn't have that big Eastern European immigration. So really, the Jewish community was pretty small, relatively small at that time. Speak more about the demographics of the rabbis who have spoken. You talked about the Auschwitz survivors, concentration camp survivors. How many were native-born Americans? How many were foreign-born?
Yeah, this is really fun stuff to talk about. It's really exciting because when you talk about the demographics of the rabbis, let's just start with the countries. There's over 20 countries other than America represented, native-born, born in other countries who have come here, who are rabbis who have prayed in Congress, meaning that Eastern European countries, all the ones you would suspect, Poland, Russia, Germany, have all produced rabbis who were guest chaplains in Congress. More current days, you have more Latin American-born rabbis who have come here as immigrants and have prayed in Congress. The immigration story, and just looking at that in terms of demographics, and we'll do a couple other demographics as well, but the immigration part of the story is amazing because it really is the ingathering. It's the ultimate melting pot of all these different rabbis who have prayed in Congress from different countries, and it's just Holocaust survivors, Russia before the war. There have been, and a subset of that, by the way, I should say, are rabbis from other countries who were not American rabbis, meaning that Great Britain has had 2 or 3 rabbis pray in Congress who were from Great Britain and were not American rabbis. Canada has had a rabbi pray. And even in Israel, several chief rabbis of Israel have prayed in Congress. The footnote, the Knesset doesn't have prayer in opening each session. So if you are a rabbi in Israel who wants to pray in front of a legislative body, you have to come to America to do it. So, over 20 countries represented. Another demographic, it gets really interesting. Women rabbis the first woman rabbi ordained in America was in the early 1970s. Sally Priesand was the first female rabbi. She was also the first woman rabbi to pray in Congress. And 1973, sponsored by a name that your viewers may remember, Bella Abzug, the former congresswoman from New York, sponsored her. There have been a lot fewer women rabbis than men rabbis. Another example is Rabbi Rachel Mikva, the daughter of Abner Mikva, was a rabbi who prayed in Congress. So the story of women who have prayed is really interesting as well. But definitely, I would just say this. I don't want to go on too much about the immigration part of this. When you get immigrant rabbis who have prayed in Congress, their prayers are full of how great America is language. They've talked about refugees. They talk about the ingathering to America. They talk about you welcomed my parents to the shores. And the prayers are full of very pro-America, pro-immigration language in their prayers.
Well, you include prayers that are simple and brilliant, as well as those that perhaps might be called somewhat less stellar. Were you trying to give readers a sense of the wide range of these invocations over the parts of 3 centuries that rabbis have opened the sessions of Congress?
Yeah, I don't normally say this, but I will tell you, Dan, a couple of these prayers were duds to me that were really uninteresting or repetitive and didn't really say much. And it sounds disrespectful, but what I was looking for in this book were the prayers that told a story, were the prayers that there was some gem in them, whether it's talking about a current event or bringing Hebrew into it or marking some other great moment. Those for me became the timeless ones. If they mentioned the environment or mentioned war or even fight against communism, or some of the rabbis themselves or great historical figures, Rabbi Leo Beck prayed, and others who marched with Dr. King. Just their stories themselves are interesting. About 70% of the rabbis who prayed in Congress are mentioned in the book. To give you an idea of just like how, in my mind, telling their story was really important, whether it's what they said or what they did. Yes, a lot of them didn't rise to that moment, but some of this, and I actually one other category, the military. There were over 100 rabbis who have prayed in Congress who are also military rabbis, military chaplains. Many of them after World War II, Vietnam era. The rabbi who has prayed the most in Congress, the Rabbi Arnold Resnikoff, was in Vietnam and fought on the front lines in the Mekong Delta, and he's in there. So just the flavor of the Jewish experience very much comes out in these stories.
You mentioned Leo Beck, who was, as you said, an important 20th century theologian who led B'nai B'rith in Germany, actually. And he led the prayer on Lincoln's birthday, February 12th, 1948. It was in the days when we observed Lincoln's birthday and Washington's birthday separately. And here's an excerpt. Quote, "The servant Abraham Lincoln said, 'We cannot escape history, so help us God, so that we cannot evade history, but we may be granted history. From the bottom of my heart, I pray, God bless America.'" Now, this is, of course, just a small part of his benediction. But what else did he say? And what do you think was the deeper meaning of his prayer and the importance of a Holocaust survivor? You mentioned there were a number of survivors offering a prayer so soon. This is like 3 years after the Shoah.
Yeah, I love that. And I love that story. And I know there are books written about Dr. Beck, and there are people who have devoted their lives to studying him. And he's just an amazing Jewish historical figure. This is one of those prayers that really struck me for everything you just mentioned. The fact that he is a European, born in Germany, was in Britain, was in England, and then 3 years after the end of the Shoah, he's in Congress. And it's the kind of thing where you wish you could go back in time and just somehow be in the chamber and see the sweep of history when he's there giving the prayer for all those reasons. An historical figure. And what does he do? It's all forward looking. It's all, bringing Lincoln, but like how great America is to have survivors there. Also, in February of 1948, just a couple weeks before Israel is independent. But that's not in there. It's almost like what's not in there, in addition to what is in there. That was his only prayer that he ever gave. But I know that there are pictures of him recreating that prayer with the official chaplain behind him for the photographers. And I think the Library of Congress has that picture. So it was a really big moment in history then when Dr. Beck gave his prayer.
Well, we've done a little bit of our own research in your book, and we discovered that there were a number of B'nai B'rith members, including rabbis Edward Kalish, Gunter Plott, who was the great Canadian rabbi, Emil Hirsch, Jay Kaufman, who was a predecessor of mine, several times removed, and Jacob Vusanger. So we have a special B'nai B'rith interest also in that list, and we're still continuing to research it. Now, who do you think were on your list? Were those who gave the, shall we call, the most valuable prayer? Who were those rabbis, and what did they say to their Capitol Hill congregation?
Dan, no one's ever asked me that before, so let me fumble a little bit to try to come up with an answer. It's funny. When I was going through this, every time I would come upon a great prayer, meaning something inspirational, it was always touching a nerve. For me, and I want to back up a second to mention the B'nai B'rith angle is fascinating, and I should have really zeroed in on that more, because you can really find out who were B'nai B'rith members or leaders because of the sponsoring remarks that were given by the members of Congress. So it's not that difficult to lift to figure out who were the B'nai B'rith. I mean, it's work, but thanks to the Congressional record being online now, you could spend time find that out. So thank you for going through that. The prayers that touched me the most were those let me say what I'm not first. I'm not an historian. I'm an amateur at all this. This is a passion project. This is something that I've enjoyed doing, in the 2 a.m. Spare moments of time of raising a family, working, all that. So I'm also not a trained Jew, meaning I'm not a rabbi. There's, I flunked out of religious school. So there's a lot of things I haven't done and I don't know. The prayers that taught me aspects of being Jewish were probably my favorite ones. And taught me new concepts, or, quoting Isaiah. I was introduced to a lot of Isaiah, the most quoted of all the prophets in the prayers. And that's opened up a whole new world for me. I've also those who bring in the Jewish history to this. I mentioned Rabbi Reznikov earlier. He and I have become great friends as a result of this project, because he's given the most number of prayers. So for me personally, a couple of these prayers really struck me. But I think as a category, without singling out any of them, just to say those who probably had the more daring messages, who kind of taught us something, who maybe pushed the boundary of the language. Some of the earliest prayers too, Washington Hebrew congregation, which actually partnered with me in the book. They've produced the most number of rabbis from a synagogue, and they go back to the very beginning, back to the 1870s. So just, in these moments here, interstitial moments of Jewish history as told here, I'm going to punt a little bit, but I think many of them are really interesting and definitely worth further study.
Well, the later chapters of When Rabbis Bless Congress are organized by topics mentioned in the prayers. And here are a few, just to give our audience a sense: the Bible, economics, sports, history, Israel, politics, civil rights, the environment, and space travel. So, which you mentioned. So what does this say about the role of Jewish clergy and the interests of American Jews and beyond that? Because the rabbis were speaking to a hall filled mostly with non-Jews. So what does it say about Jews in America when you cover this panoply of subjects?
Yeah, and actually, I want to begin a little trivial, because you mentioned sports. The one thing that comes to mind immediately is the prayer that was given by a rabbi from Illinois. I'm blanking on his name right now, but it was given after the then Washington Redskins, now the Washington football team, won the Super Bowl in 1983, a couple days after, and his prayer was full of football metaphors and fumbles and we shouldn't fumble the future, all that kind of stuff. So that was a joy to read. And I would say another, keeping this trivial for the moment, prayer. So a lot of these prayers stand up to time and are very relevant now. One prayer that was given, I believe in the early 2000 era, was given by another rabbi from Evanston, Illinois. And he, in his prayer, invoked, I believe he called him, he invoked a story told by Bill Cosby. And you don't normally hear a member of the clergy quoting Bill Cosby anymore for spiritual inspiration. So that hasn't stood up to time. Those that have, on the flip, so the question, it's a wide range of topics. It they're not getting up and they're not teaching Torah. They're not teaching the Talmud. They'll reference those books and be inspired by those books. But this is not the moment to be preaching in a small p kind of way. This is the moment when guest chaplains are in Congress to connect what's happening in the moment to the bigger sense, to God. And so Jews and rabbis, when they're up there, what's happening in the world? You mentioned civil rights earlier, and in the environment, and I love the space program related prayers because they're so interesting. But yeah, it's just a great reflection of the moment in time where they're doing. That's the time capsule for me. That's just capturing in a jar just the connection of Jews to history, to American history, and for the better for celebrations. The Gulf War, there's another example. 1991 prayers that invoked how great it is that we won so fast. And boy, you didn't hear that language in the prayers after the 2003 iteration of the Gulf War. So you just you see the reflection in there.
We talk about 400 rabbis, but some have come back for a second prayer. So we're talking about how many prayers total? About 600, correct?
That's correct. Roughly about 630, 640. So the two numbers here that are important is a 630 number of times a rabbi has given a prayer, about 420, 430 rabbis. So why are those numbers? Why in the 400s and why in the 600s? As you said, Dan, because roughly about 100 rabbis or so have given two or more prayers. Some have given, Rabbi Resnikov has given 17. He's just one short of Chai for prayers. The number 2 rabbi is Rabbi Moshe Feller, a Lubavitcher rabbi from Minnesota, who's given, I believe, 11 or 12 in the House and the Senate over the years. In Washington, Rabbi Haberman passed away, but has given, I think, in the 6 or 7 area. So a couple of them have given a lot of prayers. There are a couple who have given 2 or 3. I think roughly about 50 or so rabbis, I'm going to get into some really geeky numbers here, 50 or so rabbis have prayed both in the House and in the Senate, have done both. And now here's a real geek number for you. 13 times a rabbi has prayed in both the House and the Senate on the same day. It's happened 13 times. So coincidental rabbi prayers in Congress.
Well, Howard, you do a great job of documenting the evolution of prayer over the years as political issues and other concerns and values have changed. Is that the takeaway that you would like readers to have from this book?
So it is. I want the takeaway to be that I'm going to talk about technology here for a moment here. This kind of book where you research this amazing sliver of Jewish history. It's also an amazing sliver of congressional history. No one's ever done a book about prayer in Congress. It reflects 2 things. One, the importance or the value of this moment, not to say part of history, but this segment of history. It's also a technological value here, meaning this work could not have been done 10 years ago. I had the benefit of two big buckets of research available that weren't available prior. One is where I work, the C-SPAN video is available now in archive form. You can search that. You can see, you can really interact and see these rabbis giving the prayers. The second is the Congressional record. Just went online and searchable, going back to the early mid-19th century. So you can go through and you can find. I went through and looked at every single prayer ever given in Congress to pick out the rabbis, and there's many untold stories that are just laying there in the Congressional record. So the takeaway is what is possible to study now in the broader sense, but in the Jewish sense and even the Congressional sense, let's just study this part of history. Not be afraid of it. Not say, oh, they're praying, I don't want to see prayer in Congress. And again, totally legitimate takeaway of your own value, but don't ignore the history there because there are some really great stories to be told.
Well, my takeaway, among others, is when you consider that, again, going back to what we were saying earlier, going back to 1860, and even in 2021, I mean, the Jewish percentage, the population of the United States is really very small. And yet, it says a lot about our country and about Congress over the years that even a small segment of the community, one of, we call the three great religions, however you wish to describe it, means that you've got to be inclusive and that these people not only have a right to do this, but it's important for them to do this. And I think when you look at the story of Jews in America, I think this really contributes a great deal to it because of that fact. We think of all the other contributions that we have made to American democracy and American society, but this really homes in on a very important aspect of it, that no matter how small the community is, it has a great deal to say in terms of spirituality. And so I think you've made a tremendous contribution here to understanding that. So with that, the book is When Rabbis Bless Congress, The Great American Story of Jewish Prayers on Capitol Hill by Howard Mortman. And it's available in-store or online wherever you purchase books. Howard, thank you so much for being here today with me and revealing little-known but meaningful Jewish contributions to American society, American history, American government. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, Dan. Thank you.
Our thanks to Howard Mortman for sharing his unique perspective and speaking with us about his book, When Rabbis Bless Congress. And thank you for tuning in to this conversation with B'nai B'rith. Well, if you enjoyed this discussion, make sure you never miss a program by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel, liking us on Facebook, and following us on Twitter. And be sure to visit our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn more about our important work. See you again soon, everyone. Take care.